At the gates of Ashbourne Estate, Celeste Whitmore laughed as security searched her own husband like a stranger who had wandered in off the street. Inside beneath crystal chandeliers and the eyes of wealthy guests, she called him an embarrassment and ordered him to stand with the servants instead of beside her. Darius said nothing. He only stared at the portrait above the staircase, the one his father had forbidden anyone to remove. Minutes later, the estate attorney walked in, dismissed the guards, and announced the true owner had arrived. Celeste smiled, certain the moment was hers, never noticing the entire room had already turned to face her husband. Stay until the final signature is placed on that deed, because one cruel laugh is about to cost Celeste everything she believed she owned. Celeste had spent weeks preparing for the single most important night of her career, a gala at Ashbourne Estate that would bring together investors, local officials, and families whose wealth stretched back generations. If the evening went well, her small event company, run alongside her closest friend Whitney Carver, stood to win a multi-million-dollar contract managing every future gathering for the estate's holding company. It was the kind of opportunity she had chased since the day she first watched other women arrive at galas in cars worth more than her apartment, and she was not going to let anything stand in her way. Darius had helped her prepare for nearly a month, though few people in that ballroom would ever know it. He corrected flaws in her floor plan, caught a dangerous fault in the wiring of the guest pavilion, and designed a support system to keep the antique wood floors from cracking under the weight of the staging equipment. Celeste used every idea he gave her and never once credited him for any of it, presenting his careful work as though it had simply occurred to her overnight. 2 nights before the gala, she told him plainly that he was not to mention, under any circumstance, that he ran a small consulting firm dealing in property restoration. She feared her guests would measure her worth by his job title, and she could not afford to be measured and found wanting. Darius asked her quietly whether she was ashamed of his work or ashamed of him. Celeste brushed the question aside, insisting she only wanted the two of them to look as though they belonged in that world. When Darius pulled out an old but expertly tailored suit for the evening, she mocked it as outdated, and asked why he could not simply rent something modern, unaware that the suit had been made for him by his own father, the last time father and son had ever stood together inside Ashbourne's walls. On the drive to the estate, she reminded him repeatedly not to talk too much, not to bring up property repair work, not to argue with a man named Marlowe Pierce, and above all, not to embarrass her. They had met 9 years earlier when Celeste was still building her business, one modest wedding at a time, and Darius was working long hours, restoring a row of crumbling townhouses no one else wanted to touch. Back then, she had loved the quiet certainty in him, the way he listened before he spoke, and never once needed to raise his voice to be taken seriously. She used to tell her friends that he made her feel steady, that his calm was the safest place she had ever known. Over the years, though, as her client list grew to include senators and heiresses and men who summered on private islands, she began measuring her own life against theirs, and somewhere in that slow comparison, the steadiness she once cherished in her husband started to look in her eyes like a ceiling, rather than a foundation. She never said the word out loud, not even to herself, but by the time the invitation to Ashbourne arrived, she had already begun to see Darius as something she had outgrown. Darius watched the long rows of oak trees pass outside the window as the car wound its way toward the mansion, recognizing every curve in the road, every stone wall, every small bridge where he had once stood beside his father as a boy. Celeste mistook his silence for submission, for the quiet discomfort of a man who did not belong in such surroundings. She had no idea that her husband was returning to a home that had once been entirely his own. When the car reached the main gate, the guard scanned the guest list and found Celeste's name easily, but no trace of her husband's. She had the chance, in that single ordinary moment, to simply confirm that the man beside her was her husband. Instead, she stepped back and said loudly enough for the small crowd near the gate to hear that he was with her, but that they should check him carefully, since he was not familiar with places like this. Darius looked at her for a long moment before raising both arms and letting the guard search him without a word of protest. Tucked into the inner pocket of his jacket, the guard found a small silver key engraved with the crest of Ashbourne Estate, a key of a kind that had not been issued in decades and had only ever belonged to a handful of people connected to the family who owned the land. The guard asked where he had gotten it. Darius answered simply that it belonged to him. Celeste laughed and suggested to the small crowd that her husband had probably bought it from an antique shop to make himself feel important, and several guests standing nearby laughed along with her. The head of security considered confiscating the key, until Odessa Brooks appeared at the door, recognized Darius the instant she saw him, and gave the smallest shake of her head when he silently asked her not to say a word. She told the guard the key was harmless, and asked that it be returned to him at once. Celeste never thanked her. Instead, she pulled Darius through the entrance, scolding him for carrying such a strange object and drawing unwanted attention to them both. Inside the grand hall, Darius took in details. No one else in the room could see the portrait of his mother still hanging above the staircase. The antique clock he had once helped his father repair the wooden columns, painted in a shade slightly wrong for the period, and the handful of longtime staff who fought to keep their faces still at the sight of him. Celeste noticed none of it. Whitney arrived to greet her and immediately asked why Darius had come at all, insisting that a man like him would only cheapen the polished image Celeste had worked so hard to build for the night. She suggested he stay near the service areas instead of mingling with the guests, and Celeste did not object. When a waiter stumbled and dropped a tray of glasses, after the floor trembled beneath him, Darius knelt to help gather the shards, and Celeste, catching sight of him on his knees, called out that at least he had finally found a place that suited him. A few guests turned to look, some smiling faintly at the remark, and still Darius said nothing in return. Odessa stood nearby, her hands clenched at her sides in quiet fury on his behalf. She remembered a much smaller version of him running barefoot through these same halls, remembered bandaging his knees after he fell from the old oak near the stables, remembered the sound of his mother laughing somewhere upstairs while he practiced reading aloud in the kitchen. Watching the grown man he had become stand quietly while his own wife humiliated him in front of strangers was almost more than she could bear, and only the years of discipline that came with running a house like Ashbourne kept her rooted in place instead of speaking her mind. Darius finally asked Celeste in a low voice, meant only for her, whether she truly wanted him beside her that evening at all. She answered that she wanted a husband who could elevate her standing, not one who forced her to explain him to every stranger in the room. Darius slipped off his wedding ring, studied it for a moment, and then placed it back on his finger, deciding silently to give her one final chance to prove she could still see the man she had married. That chance did not last long. Marlowe Pierce approached soon after recognizing Darius on sight, but pretending otherwise, testing the limits of his composure by asking Celeste within earshot of half the room whether the man beside her belonged to the service staff. Celeste glanced at her husband and answered without hesitation that he did not, that he was simply someone who had come with her and did not know where he was supposed to stand. Marlowe shook Darius's hand and leaned close enough that Celeste could not hear him, murmuring that. Darius pulled Marlowe aside and asked why he was the one running the evening at all when Solomon Whitmore had never allowed Ashbourne to be turned into a stage for displays of power. Marlowe answered smoothly that Solomon was old now, his health failing, and that he no longer managed the property directly. He boasted that the board was preparing to grant him full control of Ashbourne and every resort property tied to the estate, and he reminded Darius with obvious satisfaction that a son who had walked away from his family for 12 years had no right to question the man who had stayed. He claimed Solomon had tried repeatedly to reach Darius over the years without success, and Darius began to suspect that Marlowe had been intercepting letters and messages meant for him all along. Marlowe went further still, telling Darius that the board had grown tired of waiting for a prodigal son who might never return, and that men who built empires understood the value of loyalty in a way that men who walked away simply could not. He said it with the easy confidence of someone who believed the conversation was already over, certain that 12 years of silence had settled the matter long before tonight. Darius listened without interrupting, filing away every word, recognizing the particular arrogance of a man who had spent years growing comfortable in a house that was never truly his. While the two men spoke, Celeste worked the room, telling investors she had personally consulted on the restoration of several historic properties, though nearly everything she described had come directly from her husband's research. When a potential investor asked about plans to restore the eastern wing, she repeated almost word for word the very proposal Darius had spent weeks developing. Marlowe praised her warmly and hinted at a lucrative contract to come once the evening concluded. Darius realized then that his work had not only been claimed by his wife, but had already been passed along to Marlowe without his knowledge or consent. And when he confronted her about it, Celeste admitted freely that she had sent Marlowe the entire consulting file, insisting that as his wife, anything he created belonged to her as well. Darius warned her that the plan contained an unfinished section concerning the Eastern Foundation, a section that could cause serious structural damage if implemented before the analysis was complete. Celeste waved the concern away, certain that Marlowe's engineers knew better than her husband ever could. Whitney fed the fire further, telling Celeste that Darius was only trying to sabotage her success out of jealousy. Marlowe invited Celeste onto the small stage to present the restoration proposal herself, and she accepted eagerly, believing this was the moment that would finally secure her place among people she had spent years trying to impress. Darius slipped away to find Odessa, hoping to learn more about his father, and what she told him changed the shape of the entire evening. Solomon, Odessa said, was resting in the West Wing at that very moment, and he had already asked the family attorney Everett Sloan to arrive that night with an important legal document in hand. Solomon knew his son would be there. The gala, it turned out, was never simply a fundraiser. It was also the night meant to announce who would take control of the entire family estate, and Odessa pressed a sealed envelope into Darius's hands, explaining that his father had left it for him days earlier. Inside was a single line written in his father's familiar handwriting, telling him that he could refuse his father's fortune if he wished, but he should not allow greedy men to destroy the legacy his mother had built. Darius looked up at the portrait of his mother once more, and in that instant he understood that Marlowe intended to sell off part of Ashbourne before the night was even over. The details Darius uncovered were worse than he expected. Marlowe had quietly prepared an agreement to sell the Eastern Wing, along with nearly 1,000 acres of surrounding land, to a development company planning a private resort, a deal that would demolish the housing long used by the, quote, estate's longtime staff, and turn a protected forest into a private golf course. Solomon had never approved any part of it. Marlowe intended to use the old man's failing health as cover, telling the board he had given verbal consent long before anyone thought to question it. Darius told Celeste plainly that the gala she had spent months organizing was being used to disguise an illegal transaction, but she refused to believe him, certain he only wanted to ruin the success she had worked so hard to earn. He asked her to pause her presentation long enough for him to review the paperwork himself. She refused, explaining that Marlowe had promised her a substantial payment and the exclusive right to manage every future event held at Ashbourne. Darius asked her directly whether she would choose the contract over the truth, if it came down to a single choice, and without hesitation, she told him that at least the contract offered her a future. The words landed with quiet finality, confirming that she no longer saw him as any part of that future at all. She climbed onto the stage soon after and introduced the restoration plan, as though it were entirely her own creation. When a guest asked who had conducted the detailed technical assessments, she looked directly at Darius, standing at the back of the room, and told the crowd that her internal team had handled everything themselves. Darius did not interrupt. He let her finish the lie, in front of hundreds of witnesses watching her accept applause for work that was never hers to claim. Marlowe raised a glass in her honor, hinting that she would soon hold a formal position within the new management structure, and Celeste's confidence swelled to its highest point of the night. When Darius finally moved toward the stage, she assumed he intended to steal her moment. So she signaled to security to stop him before he came any closer. In front of the entire room, she announced that her husband was struggling to accept his wife's success, and Darius asked her one final time whether she truly wanted to defend that lie by humiliating him in public. Celeste told him coldly that he had never belonged in this world, and that he should stop pretending he had any say in what happened inside it. She ordered security to escort him out of the great hall. Odessa stepped forward to object, but Marlowe silenced her and sent her back toward the service quarters. Darius walked calmly toward the door without a trace of resistance, his jaw tight, but his stride unhurried, refusing to give the watching crowd the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. He had spent his whole life learning to swallow moments like this one, to let insult slide past him the way rain slides off stone, and tonight would be no different, or so he told himself, as the guards closed in on either side of him. Just before he crossed the threshold, every light in the eastern wing went dark, and a heavy splitting crack echoed beneath the floor. Panic rippled through the crowd as the crack grew louder, and a section of the eastern floor began to sink under the weight of staging equipment installed without the temporary supports Darius had warned about in his unfinished report. Marlowe tried to calm the guests, insisting it was nothing more than an electrical malfunction, but Darius noticed the chandelier swaying and fresh fractures spreading across the support columns, and he immediately called for the area to be cleared. Marlowe ordered the guards to continue removing him from the building, but Darius raised his voice, commanding the band to stop and the crowd to move toward the south lawn, and something in the authority of his tone made Odessa and the Pandas, longtime staff, obey him instantly. One of Marlowe's own engineers confirmed within moments that the foundation was at genuine risk of collapse. Darius led a small group of staff toward an old evacuation route behind the library, using the same silver key that had been mocked at the gate to open a door sealed shut for years. Celeste watched stunned as the estate's staff followed her husband's every order without a second thought. Darius knew exactly where the main electrical shutoff was located. Which corridors could not bear the weight of the staging equipment, which columns had been reinforced during his childhood, how to trigger the manual evacuation alarm, and where the emergency support beams had been stored decades earlier. He worked alongside the staff to stabilize the structure until the professional engineering crews arrived, and by the time they did not, a single guest had been seriously hurt, though the gala itself had collapsed into chaos, and Marlowe's plans stood dangerously close to exposure. Celeste offered no gratitude to her husband. Instead, she accused him of causing the chaos and frightening away every investor she had worked to impress. Darius pointed to the sunken section of floor and told her plainly that this was the direct consequence of presenting an unfinished plan as though it were complete and safe. She still refused to accept any responsibility for what had happened. Marlowe tried to shift the blame onto Darius, claiming he had tampered with the estate's structure before the event began, and the security team moved to detain him for questioning. Before they could, Everett Sloan arrived with 2 legal associates and ordered everyone to step back from Darius, immediately demanding to know who had authorized the use of an uncertified design in the first place. Celeste's own electronic signature appeared on the deployment documents, a fact she could not explain away. Whitney quietly slipped toward the edge of the crowd, hoping to avoid being noticed. Everett announced that every contract signed that night would be suspended until the rightful owner of Ashbourne made a final decision. Marlowe insisted that Solomon was far too frail to appear before anyone. Everett answered simply that he was not speaking about Solomon at all, and every eye in the room turned toward the staircase as Odessa walked calmly to Darius's side and addressed him by a name none of them expected to hear. The room fell utterly silent. Celeste assumed Odessa had simply confused him with someone else, or perhaps was trying to shield him from further embarrassment. Darius offered no explanation at first. He climbed the staircase and stopped beneath the portrait of a young woman in a blue dress, and Everett explained that the woman was Lenora Whitmore Solomon's late wife and Darius's mother, a respected preservation architect who had once saved Ashbourne from demolition decades earlier. Darius was the sole living heir of both Solomon and the portion of the estate his mother had left behind. Celeste stood frozen, remembering vaguely a photograph she had once seen of her mother-in-law, but never recognizing her, since the portrait had been painted when Lenora was still a very young woman. Darius stood beneath that painting for a long moment. Before he spoke again, remembering how his mother used to stand in almost the exact same spot each evening, watching the sun drop behind the tree line, while she sketched restoration plans by hand, long before she ever touched a computer. She had been the one who taught him to read the bones of an old building the way other children learned to read storybooks, showing him how a single hairline crack in a foundation could tell the story of decades of neglect if a person only knew how to listen. He had not stood in this exact spot since her funeral, and something in the weight of the silence around him now made 12 years of distance feel, for just a moment, impossibly small. Darius revealed piece by piece the truth he had carried alone for years. He had grown up within these very walls. The silver key opened private sections of the estate, reserved only for family. The outdated suit Celeste had mocked earlier that night was the last gift his father had ever given him. His deep knowledge of the property's construction came from years spent working alongside his mother before her death. The small consulting firm he ran had been built specifically to preserve historic neighborhoods without ever relying on the weight of the Whitmore name. Celeste asked why he had kept all of it hidden from her, and Darius answered that he had never truly hidden his estrangement from his family, but that she had long since stopped asking questions. Once she decided his past held no value for her, he explained that he had once planned to introduce her to his father when their marriage felt strong enough to withstand the complications of wealth. But over time, he noticed how differently she treated people depending on how much money or splendid status they held. He wanted to know in the end whether she loved him or simply loved what he might eventually be able to give her, and the events of that single night had finally answered his question in full. Marlowe interjected, insisting Darius had voluntarily given up his inheritance years earlier. But Everett confirmed that while Darius had once refused any profit from the estate, he had never signed away his ownership. Lenora, moreover, had left the majority of voting control over Ashbourne directly to her son, meaning Darius had always held greater authority than Marlowe, even though he had never once chosen to use it. Celeste rushed toward him, her voice suddenly soft, calling him her beloved husband, and insisting the entire evening had simply been a misunderstanding brought on by stress. Darius asked her plainly whether she wished to speak to the husband she had ordered out of the room only minutes earlier, or to the heir of the house she now realized she stood inside. Celeste had no answer for him. Everett informed them both that Solomon was still very much alive, resting behind the door of his private office, and that he wished to speak with both of them at once. Darius stepped into his father's old office and found Solomon seated near the window, thinner and frailer than the man he remembered, though his mind remained as sharp as ever. Father and son faced each other for the first time in 12 long years. Solomon admitted that he had once been far too rigid, that he had wanted his son to inherit the family's empire without ever truly listening to Darius's concern for the workers and communities connected to their land. Darius accused his father of allowing Marlowe to seize control of Ashbourne and twist his mother's legacy into little more than a tool for profit. Solomon confessed that he had noticed signs of fraud months earlier, but needed proof before acting, and with his health declining, he had quietly asked Everett to investigate the matter without alerting anyone else. Solomon's voice caught as he admitted that not a single week had passed in 12 years without him thinking of his son, that he had kept Darius's boyhood room untouched, and that he had written more letters than he could count, never knowing whether any of them reached their destination. Darius told his father quietly, but without cruelty, that a letter meant little to a boy who had spent his whole childhood being told that love in this family came with conditions attached. Solomon did not argue the point. He simply nodded, accepting the weight of it, and for the first time in longer than either man could remember, an honest silence passed between them, instead of an angry one. Marlowe, it turned out, had been intercepting Solomon's letters to his son for years, altering financial reports, funneling maintenance funds into a company he secretly controlled, forging records of consent for the land sale, and working to make Solomon appear less capable than he truly was. The gala had been arranged specifically so Marlowe could gather investors and finalize the sale before the ongoing investigation could reach its conclusion. Solomon knew Celeste had organized the event, but he had no idea she had used her husband's designs without his permission. He asked her directly why she had treated his son as though he were something to be ashamed of, Celeste insisted she had never known who Darius truly was. Solomon answered quietly that she had known he was her husband, and that alone should have been enough. The words struck at the very heart of her betrayal. Celeste broke into tears, claiming she had been pressured and manipulated by both Whitney and Marlowe throughout the evening. Darius reminded her that no one had forced her to laugh while he was searched at the gate to claim credit for work that was never hers, or to order him removed from a room he had every right to stand in. Marlowe was brought into the office soon after attempting to threaten that the entire property management structure would collapse without him at the helm. Darius produced records he had quietly gathered on his own, after noticing several of Ashbourne's historic buildings had been repaired to standards far below what preservation required. Records he had begun collecting, well before he ever agreed to attend the gala that night, though he had never imagined the scale of the fraud would run so deep. Everett combined those findings with financial evidence already in hand, more than enough to suspend Marlowe from his position immediately. Solomon slid 2 documents across the desk, one granting Darius full operational control of Ashbourne, the other an amended will transferring authority over the entire family estate to his son. Solomon told him he did not need to forgive his father that very night, but that Ashbourne needed someone who would protect it. Darius picked up the pen, then paused, and asked that every guest be brought back into the great hall so the truth could be spoken openly before them all. The guests filed back into the hall, the damaged section of floor now cordoned off behind them. Celeste stood close to her husband, hoping to project the image of a united couple who had simply weathered a difficult evening together. Darius stepped away, putting clear distance between them for anyone watching to see. Everett addressed the room and announced that Marlowe had been suspended effective immediately, that the land sale had been canceled, that every financial record from his tenure would be turned over to investigators, that any contract signed under his authority that night was void, that Darius now held full voting control over Ashbourne Estate, and that Solomon had formally transferred operational authority of the entire property network to his son. The same guests who had laughed when Darius was searched at the gate now stood in complete silence. The guard from the entrance approached him quietly to apologize, and Darius, understanding the man had only been following instructions, asked simply who had requested that he be searched so thoroughly in the first place. The guard confirmed that Celeste herself had asked for the extra scrutiny before they ever reached the door. Darius realized then that the humiliation had never been a misunderstanding at all, but a choice Celeste had made deliberately to draw a clear line between herself and a husband she believed beneath her. Whitney attempted to slip away from the gathering, but was stopped by Everett since she too had helped distribute the design files without authorization. Celeste asked to speak with him privately. Darius refused, telling her that since she had chosen to humiliate him in front of a crowd, the truth deserved to be spoken in front of that same crowd as well. He did not expose the private details of their marriage, choosing only to confirm that the restoration plans belonged to his firm and that Celeste had used them without consent. She lost the very contract she had fought so hard to secure, her reputation damaged by both the safety failure and the exposed dishonesty surrounding her work. Marlowe sneered that Darius had only won because of the name he carried, and Darius answered that his expertise alone had kept the mansion from collapsing that night, and that the Whitmore name had only handed him the responsibility of repairing everything Marlowe had already broken. Solomon rose to address the room himself, declaring that his son was not merely an heir waiting in the wings. Darius was in fact already the rightful owner of the portion of the estate left to him by his mother, including the main residence, the eastern wing, and the very land Marlowe had tried to sell out from under the family. Everett handed Darius the final documents, and before the eyes of every guest who remained, he signed his name and formally assumed control of Ashbourne Estate. He then turned to Celeste, who whispered to him that everything within those walls now belonged to them both. Darius removed his wedding ring and set it gently atop the contract she had signed without his consent, telling her quietly that none of it had ever truly belonged to them together, and asking Everett in the same breath to prepare the Pleston paperwork for a divorce and a full audit of her company's records. In the weeks that followed, investigators uncovered that Marlowe had embezzled millions of dollars and accepted secret payments from the development company eager to purchase Ashbourne's land, leading to charges of fraud, forgery, and dollars theft. Whitney reached a cooperation agreement with authorities in exchange for a lighter sentence, admitting she had known Celeste was using Darius's work without permission and had encouraged it anyway, hungry for the contract it promised to bring. Celeste's event company lost its most valuable clients, not because Darius used his newfound power against her, but because the safety failure and the exposed dishonesty had already reached the ears of every partner she once relied upon. She moved out of the home they had shared while the divorce moved forward, and more than once she asked to see him again, insisting she still loved him. Whitney's departure from their partnership left Celeste to answer for the fallout alone, fielding calls from panicked clients who had seen the story of Ashbourne's near collapse spread through every circle she had once hoped to join. The very guests she had tried so hard to impress that night now avoided her calls, entirely unwilling to attach their names to a woman whose carelessness had nearly brought a historic estate down around them. Darius never once used his family's influence to accelerate her downfall, though it would have taken little effort on his part, choosing instead to let the natural consequences of her choices run their course. When they finally sat across from each other in a lawyer's office, Celeste admitted her mistake had been born from never knowing how wealthy his family truly was. Darius told her plainly that this admission was exactly why their marriage could not continue. If her regret had only surfaced after learning what he stood to inherit, then her apology was never meant for the husband she had wounded, but for the luxurious life she had just lost the chance to claim. Celeste argued that he too bore some blame, accusing him of testing her loyalty by hiding the truth. Darius acknowledged that keeping his family history secret for so long had not been a perfect choice, but reminded her that he had never lied about his character, his work, or the love he had given her. He had not created her cruelty. He had simply chosen not to let money conceal it from view. Darius made no claim on anything Celeste had earned through her own labor, and he did nothing to use his family's influence to destroy her career beyond the consequences she had already brought upon herself. He asked only for a few simple things, in return recognition of the intellectual property he had created, fair compensation for the designs used without permission, a clean and honest end to their marriage, and an agreement that she would never invoke the Whitmore name to chase future business. Celeste finally understood that Darius had never wanted revenge against her. Her greatest loss was not the mansion, the land, or the status she had chased so eagerly, but the man who had once stood faithfully beside her, long before he had anything at all to offer. Before she signed the final papers, Celeste asked whether he had ever intended to tell her the truth. Darius admitted that he had carried the silver key that night, planning to walk her through his mother's garden after the gala ended, intending to finally introduce her to his father. That evening had once been meant as the night he brought her fully into his family. Instead, she had chosen to push him out of the very house that could have become her own. After she left, Solomon handed his son a small wooden box containing his mother's final unfinished designs for the future of Ashbourne, a project she had never lived to complete. 6 months later, Darius stood as the official steward of Ashbourne Estate, having chosen not to transform it into the lavish resort Marlowe once envisioned. Instead, he carried forward the unfinished vision his mother had left behind, restoring the surrounding forest and its historic structures, rebuilding proper housing for the staff who had served the family for decades, opening a training center dedicated to architectural preservation, awarding contracts to local businesses instead of outside developers, and setting aside a portion of the grounds for the surrounding community to enjoy. He established a preservation fund carrying his mother's name, ensuring her work would continue long after his own lifetime. Odessa was appointed to a new advisory council, focused on protecting the rights of the workers who kept the estate running. The longtime staff who had quietly served the family for years finally received fair wages and a share in the profits their labor had always helped create. Darius restructured the entire management board to ensure no single executive could ever again seize the kind of unchecked power Marlowe once held. His relationship with his father slowly began to heal, though 12 years of distance could not be erased overnight, and the two men learned gradually to speak honestly instead of punishing each other with silence. Solomon admitted that he had once used his authority to control rather than guide his son, while Darius acknowledged that he had walked away without ever giving his father the chance to change. Together they agreed that Ashbourne would no longer stand as a symbol of guarded private wealth, but would become a legacy built to serve the people around it. At the opening ceremony for the new preservation center, Darius wore the very suit Celeste had once mocked as outdated, standing beneath the portrait of his mother, as he told the gathered crowd that she had taught him a home was never measured by the size of its land, but by how the people who crossed its threshold were treated once they arrived. He never spoke Celeste's name that day. He never needed to, because the truth of that night had already made itself clear to everyone who was there to witness it. A truth, as simple as it was, unforgettable people often reveal their truest selves the moment they believe the person standing before them has no power left to answer back. After the ceremony ended, Darius walked out into his mother's garden with his father beside him, neither man speaking, as they crossed the quiet grounds together. Darius used the same silver key once mocked at a gate to open a small gate that had remained locked for years, revealing a weathered sign his mother had left behind long ago, reading simply that a legacy does not belong to the one who inherits it, but to the one brave enough to protect it. He looked out over Ashbourne Estate, the same grounds where his own wife had once treated him as though he belonged nowhere near its doors. He did not stand there that day as a man who had merely proven his wealth to those who doubted him. He stood there as a man who had proven that his sense of worth had never once depended on money at all. Celeste had laughed that night, certain her husband owned nothing within those walls, never imagining that he owned every inch of the estate around her. Yet what she lost that evening was never truly the mansion, the land, or the status she had chased so desperately for years. What she lost was the man who had loved her long before he ever revealed that he had anything worth taking. There would be other galas at Ashbourne in the years that followed. Other crowds gathered beneath the same chandeliers, but none of them would ever forget the night a woman mocked her husband at the gate only to watch every door in the house open for him instead. Darius rarely spoke of that evening, himself preferring to let his work speak in its place, the restored roofs and the reopened trails, and the young apprentices learning trades their grandparents had once practiced on this very land. But every so often, when a new guest asked him how he had come to run such a place, he would simply say that his mother built it to shelter people, not to measure them, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making sure it never forgot the difference. Never humiliate someone because you believe they hold no power over your life. Their silence may not be weakness at all. It may simply be the last quiet chance you are given to discover exactly who they truly are.